I'm very excited to welcome you to the first event of Africana Week. By the way, this is the first edition as Africana Week because, as you may know, we recently, as a department, changed our name from African American and African Studies to Africana Studies. This name change reflects a alignment with other campuses in the Rutgers system, but it also is an opportunity for us to reflect the truly global nature of Black studies. And so one of the things that members of the faculty wanted to reflect in naming the Department of Africana is really the local global connections and comparisons that we're all interested in. With that in mind, I'm really excited to introduce to you all Dr. Amelia Herbert. Her work in so many ways embodies and exemplifies these local global connections that we are interested in. Dr. Herbert she is originally from Rahway, New Jersey. She has been an educator in New Jersey public schools at every level, I believe. And she, after engaging in that work, she continued to want to be a researcher in the field of the anthropology of education, and she did her PhD at the Columbia School of Education? Yeah, School of Education, or Teachers College at Columbia, working in the anthropology of education and Black studies. So today we're going to talk to her about her work. She'll give a presentation of about 45 minutes, but she's very interested in having a conversation with all of us. So we'll definitely leave time for that. I'll also just note there's a couple of other events this week as a part of Africana Studies Week. So after today, there is an alumni discussion that I'll be hosting with graduates from our program on Zoom on this Thursday at 5 p.m. And also on Friday, there will be an artist talk with Noelle Lorraine Williams, 19th century Black Power, very dynamic public humanities scholar, curator. Very excited for that. And then also Saturday is the event Teaching Against Erasure, which is an online discussion training series thinking about ways of incorporating marginalized experiences and perspectives in the New Jersey curriculum. So you can find more information about all those events on the department's website. You can also hashtag, if you do that kind of thing, hashtag FM run, okay. It's somewhere you can find. RUNAfAmWeek, I think is the hashtag. Sorry, Christina. So those are the events this week, but really excited for this event to be hearing from Dr. Herbert in her talk, Breathwork, Schooling, and the Politics of Black Aspiration. Please welcome Dr. Herbert.
Thank you all so much. I really appreciate the warm introduction and the opportunity to speak to you all today and be in conversation about the work that I'm doing. And I want to start off by just saying shout out to, there's a couple students in here from the Intro to Africana Studies course who I got to talk to recently. And so you'll see some similar things, but even your feedback was really helpful in how I was thinking about this. And I'll start off by just giving kind of a broad overview. So my research in a really big picture is really concerned with thinking about the roles that education plays in the construction and also the subversion of racialized inequality, right? Historically, a lot of us can probably call up examples of the way that education has been used to construct the unequal world that we now occupy, and how that is continually happening, but also how education has been a tool, right, to subvert these forces and, for liberation. And so I really work in that space at a broad level. And today I'm going to be talking about the research that I did for my dissertation and that I'm currently expanding into a book. And again, excited to hear your thoughts on it as I do that. So I'll be kind of zooming in on this idea of breathwork, but really by way of my lingering sort of interest in aspiration, right? The concept of aspiration and how aspiration plays a big role in how we think about schooling and its purposes, right? And I really think about these things particularly pertaining to Black youth, right? But in a transnational perspective, right? Thinking about across the globe in different contexts. And in particular, I'm going to take you on my sort of journey to these questions through my work in the US, right here in New York. And how that led me to asking questions in South Africa, and engaging with educators and young people and families in Cape Town in particular. So I'm going to start off with a bit of participation. I always find this to be a funny thing in my classes because it's a real risk to ask everyone to take out their phone because then they might stay there forever, but hopefully that won't happen. So what I'm going to ask you to do is to take out your phone, and when you take out your phone, I'm going to ask you to just quickly go to this site, menti.com, and you can type in a code. That code is 2990-3350. And I just want you to think for a moment, give you 30 seconds or so, and I just want you to think of one word that comes to mind when you hear aspiration, right? What do you think of when you hear aspiration? And if you could enter it and submit it, and I'll give you a few moments to do that. Welcome to those coming in. So glad you're here. Yay.
Is there a runtime?
There should be a guest one. Yes. That you can get into easily with no. And if you're just entering, I'll give a few more seconds for you to do this. Hopefully you have your phone handy. If you don't have a smartphone for some reason, that's fine. You can think of it and write it down somewhere, and we'll get a chance to bring that up. But if you just go to menti.com and type in this code, and then I would just like you to share one word in there that you think of when you hear aspiration. And I'll give a little bit of time, so I'll do that. Logged out, but it's okay. We're back. So, hopefully, So thank you all for doing that. As you can see, it's populating with a bunch of your ideas. And I like to start off this way just to kind of see where we all are in terms of how we think about aspiration. And often the words that people end up putting are somehow connected to their own journey. So you can see that some of them are kind of popping up bigger than others because many of us have said them, right? Goals, hope, dreams, striving, interesting one, and kind of rearranging as we are filling it out. I want to just get a couple of your own voices before we start, so I'm going to call out some of the bigger ones, and I'm just going to ask someone who said that word if they wouldn't mind telling us a bit about what made them choose that for aspiration. So somebody who said hope. I'm curious for someone who said hope, who is willing to kind of just give us a quick sense of what made them say that. Hope. Teachers are good at awkward silence. It's bad. Thank you. Thanks, Robin.
It's just what automatically came to mind. So I think, as I think about hope, it's freedom, it's the ability to create your own space, your own world, and to be able to go as far as your mind would let you go, and then beyond that. So it's limitless, and it's defined by self in a state of being where you're just free.
You popped up some keywords that I love. We're going to come back to self, right? It can be self-directed, self-driven, right? And you even talked about sort of the limitlessness, right? It's expansive. Someone who said dreams. Anyone who said dreams? Yeah, go ahead.
I said dreams because to aspire to me is to dream, but my aspirations are.
So they're the things that you are sort of wishing into existence or dreaming into existence. And I like connecting yours with Robin's point about self, right? Because they're very much about your own particular desires, right? I'm interested because desire is one I normally see. Oh, there it is, popped up. Okay, because it wasn't there yet, but desiring to succeed. I also see, again, striving. Someone who said striving. We'll end there, but who said striving? And can you just give us a sense of why you said that? Yeah, go ahead.
So I was thinking about striving because when I think about aspiration, I kind of think of the two as similar. But I think one thing about them is that they're moving towards a specific kind of idea of what dreams and hopes and goals are.
Yeah, if I could add to yours, what I like about striving is that a lot of these we see have sort of a hopeful, positive spin. Striving brings up some work, right?
Yes.
Some sort of sweat, right? Even I saw grit up here, right? Some sort of, maybe there's obstacles, maybe the terrain in which we are dreaming and hoping is not just so smooth all the time, right? So we're gonna get at all aspects of this, kind of the self and its role in this, the sort of work of it, the obstacles, right? And I appreciate you all sharing because it just gives me a sense of where we are as I kind of critically start to approach aspiration, because in a lot of education circles I've been in, people are like, why are you talking negatively and critically about aspiration? We should all have aspirations. And we're going to get into why my work really asks critical questions about it. So I'm just going to go back, if you wouldn't mind, to the slides. And as we kind of go through this, and I take you through my journey, this research and these questions, you can keep in mind those things that you initially said, and if they sort of shift or move throughout the presentation as I go through my experiences and my research today. So to start off, I think that it's really important for this, this research question to kind of go through my journey, right? Questions often come from our own journeys. Particularly my journey through education as both a teacher and a learner. And they really have impacted the way that I approach my work in multiple ways. So this first image here is me, and it is me in my first school, right, that I ever went to, right here in Newark, New Jersey, called the Chad School. And it's an institution that was here for a long time. Some of you may have even heard of it. And if you can see closely, right on my chest, that badge, right, there's a picture of the continent of Africa on it, right? And one of the things that I think in looking at my journey to this research is really kind of a diasporic lens, right, on Blackness, right? And thinking about how even from my very first educational experiences, going to a school like the Chad School in Newark, it was a Black independent school, It has actually been written about extensively. There's a text called We Are an African People, if you're ever interested in reading more about this school, written by historian Russell Bickford. And it talks about how it was part of a wave of, Black independent schools that were really thinking about kind of inculcating a diasporic lens in young people in terms of them thinking about their own education and their own struggles in education as connected to Black people all over the globe, right? And sort of that journey of education as one that is fundamentally about liberation, right? So it kind of really shaped my early thinking about schooling, especially because our teachers, right, were from all over the sort of Black diaspora, right? So we had teachers from all throughout the continent, we had teachers from the Caribbean, we had teachers from the US, and all of these were Black teachers coming from experiences of sort of understanding Blackness and anti-Blackness around the world in different contexts, right? So that is kind of my early experience of schooling that already kind of politicizes what I understand schooling to be and do in the world. And then eventually, after I graduate from college, I actually become a teacher, right? And so I started off teaching in the public school district, Newark Public Schools, at Spencer Avenue School actually. I eventually teach in a charter school in Newark. And I always love sort of using this picture because it's a moment where it's flipped, right? My students are teaching me how to do something better, which often happens in the classroom. And, I want to zoom in here because the way that I got to my research in South Africa was actually in my classroom, right? A visitor that I encountered in my classroom from South Africa really sort of sparked my interest in questions that I hadn't ever thought about. And before I sort of shift into talking about that story, I want to also just help people recall, and some of us may not remember this, but this was a really pivotal time in Newark schools, right? So I was teaching from 2005 to 2013, and some of you may remember that in 2010, right, there was a big controversial announcement that Mark Zuckerberg, right, Facebook founder, was giving $100 million to Newark schools, right? And that money would be matched and that money would change education in the city. But there were very particular visions of what that change would look like. And myself, working in a charter school that was very much a part of that story, I really started to sort of ask really scrutinizing questions, right, about the sort of policy reach of my employer. But what this visit really sparked for me, from a principal from a South African school in my classroom, it sparked me to think about the global policy reach, right, of my employer and of the funders of my school. And I started to have some really critical questions. And so as I mentioned, I was in my classroom teaching a lesson in global history, actually at the time, and a principal from a school in Cape Town, South Africa showed up in the back of the room. And, our school, we always had visitors. They were, considered to be at the sort of forefront of education reform, doing things well that other people could learn from. But we didn't have many staff of color, many visitors of color, although our students, right, were all Black and brown students from Newark. And so this visitor from South Africa stood out to us, right? He appeared to be a Black man to us. He had locks. We were like, who is this guy? And afterwards, he kind of came up. He saw our curiosity and he said, I see a lot of similarities with what's happening here in Newark and what's happening in Cape Town, right? And in the other contexts I've been in terms of how people are thinking about reforming education. And he had some concerns, even though he was in the heart of the work just like me. And I learned that he was actually in a fellowship program that was taking educators from South Africa, from India, from the UK, from Brazil, right? Contexts where racialized histories have shaped inequality in education. And they were traveling to the US to learn from charter schools, right? And not only to learn about practices in their own schools, but to actually learn about policy change and influence in education, right? So I started to really have this broader view of, there's something bigger at play going on in the sort of world of educational change. And my first trip to South Africa was actually initiated through that. I worked as a teacher educator in his school, but during the time I actually got to visit a lot of contexts throughout Cape Town. And at one point I was in a teacher workshop with teachers from all over Cape Town, from public schools, from private schools, and I was shocked because we got a handout about the ways to change student culture in your school, and on the photo was a Newark school. right, that I knew, right? A gymnasium full of black and brown kids, hands raised, right, in their morning meeting. And I had this moment of really understanding, you know, here I am in Cape Town, seeing this image of Nork School, Nork students circulating. And underneath it, it's very hard to read, so I'll read it for you. It says, not only is a strong disciplinary climate consistently and strongly associated with better performance across most countries, but improving the disciplinary climate seems to be a universally effective strategy to improve achievement. Looked at another way, an orderly environment negates the impact of income level on achievement, right? So these questions about the achievement gap, right, and the achievement gap globally, and you know, I started to realize that some of the, you know, things at my school back in Newark that I had left at that point was forwarding around no excuses discipline, around really punitive practices, were actually being shared as kind of the solution to education for racially marginalized youth across contexts in the world, right? And I started to think, well, I think I'm a person who cares about kids, and I worked in a school like this too, right? What's going on here? How is it that I have been forwarding and actively participating in the spread of these kinds of practices? What is the underlying, you know, sort of rationale that would support this? And I started to really think about aspiration, because one of the narratives that was at play in all these schools with, you know, colleagues that I was talking to was, well, the solution to this inequality is we need to inculcate higher aspirations, right, in black youth and marginalized youth. We need them to be able to achieve those aspirations, and the best, most efficient way, right, is if we set up these highly disciplinary, you know, schooling environments that sort of they can just smoothly navigate to those aspirations. So I started to think about how a really sort of benevolent discourse like aspiration could also be driving the marketization of schools, right, the further inculcation of these ideas that, you know, young black students need particular kinds of discipline. And it really was a moment for me of trying to understand more, well, how is aspiration itself a political discourse, right? We don't really examine it because it's something that is sort of objectively good, right? But how is it being used as a device in ways that may actually be reinforcing, right, the status quo? And so I started to really want to dive into these questions more deeply. And I ended up actually working with the school that visitor who came to my Newark classroom was leading at the time, right? And I did that for a couple of reasons. Before I kind of get into the details of my study, I found that school to be very interesting because while they were part of a low-fee private school network, increasing like privatization of schools in Cape Town, they were taking a totally different approach. They were not doing the sort of disciplinary narrative. They had a whole social emotional learning component, but it was still very much around aspiration. So I was like, this is kind of a best case scenario where I can really put this aspiration narrative to the test to see, you know, what work does it do, even in contexts where people are not trying to sort of reinforce these you know, punitive views on how to work with marginalized youth. So just to kind of give you a sense of my question and how I kind of approached the research. So my central question really was, how do students, alumni, families, and educators navigate the politics of aspiration in an anti-Black city and marketized schooling landscape? And I'll break down some of the kind of concepts that are in that question in just a minute, but just really highlighting that, again, I wanted to approach aspiration as political from the outset, right? And understand how different people within the school were navigating it. In terms of how I really defined aspiration, I drew on some scholarly work, which I'll talk about in a minute, and my own experience in the school to think about aspiration as the capacity to navigate social space toward desired futures, right? That's the definition that I'm working with. And again, I'll get into some of the parts of that definition. And to give you a sense of the site, so this school is called Launch, right? It was a low-fee private school. It is a low-fee private school network established in 2004. It's part of a growing sector of low-fee private schools, not only in South Africa, but across the continent of Africa, which very much are tied to conversations with, you know, charter schools here in the United States, academy schools in the UK, right? A broader transnational shift toward privatized version of schools. And it was located in Cape Town's oldest township, which I'll get in a minute into the history of townships and why that really matters for my study. And in terms of methods, I did participant observation. I'm an ethnographer, right? So that means that our data is really, people's stories and narratives, sitting with people, being in their everyday context. And I went on several trips between 2014 and 2019. The longest of them was 13 months, right? Actually staying for a whole school year and working in different capacities in the school as an educator, right? To understand as much as I could, because, we'll get into the politics of ethnography, but as much as I could, trying to understand the daily lived experience. I did interviews with, I did 35 semi-structured interviews. Some of those were multiple times with the same person, so 35 interviewees. An educational autobiography survey where I worked with the grade 12 students for us, and we really thought about what were our narratives through education. And unfocused groups, which we can in the Q&A get into that if people are more interested in how I approach these. But I want to just zoom in that this school, again, like my school in Newark, like many schools that I've seen, really had a mission around aspiration, right? Encouraging high aspirations in all our students to reverse the social engineering of apartheid, right? So they are actually explicitly communicating aspiration as a political thing, right? That in the context of Black youth whose aspirations in terms of the apartheid legacy had been constricted, right? The whole idea was part of our work is to expand aspirations of young Black students in Cape Town. So let's get into just a bit of unpacking before I kind of get into my main insight. So to get a sense of the research context, I mentioned that, I had this question about how do people navigate the politics of aspiration, right, in an anti-Black city, right, in a marketized schooling landscape, right? Right here from our perspective in Newark, we understand that aspiration doesn't occur on an even terrain, right? That we are navigating towards futures on terrain that is very uneven, and that has been shaped by the histories, right, that sort of characterize our context. And so in South Africa and in Cape Town in particular, that's very true. So this is actually an image, it's an aerial image of the border of a wealthy area in Cape Town and a township community in Cape Town. And the reason that I showed this was actually on the cover of Time magazine in 2019, related to a story about South Africa as the world's most unequal country. However, again, I think that a bigger sort of takeaway for us is thinking about how the landscapes that we all navigate have been carved by unequal histories of racial capitalism, right? And when I use that term racial capitalism, it's really thinking about how, capitalist accumulation is always resting on creating differences, right? Different types of people that can do different types of work, be exposed to different types of condition, right? And when we see even the landscape, how not only the social terrain, but the physical terrain, right, is carved out by this. So when we think about the history of townships, right, townships were areas that were officially designated for Black occupation under both colonial and apartheid regimes, right? And often were populated as a result of forced removals of Black people from areas that were designated white, right? And often, again, seen in relationship to city areas defined as white as areas for laboring classes to live, right? That could supply labor to the white city, right? And so what we see is that even in the current day, the legacy of that still exists in the landscape, right? And when we think about aspiration and moving toward our desired futures, that shapes that journey, right? So getting into the discussion for a moment. So one of the things I like to sort of tell students when I work with them is something a mentor told me once, right? That anytime you are writing a book, writing an article, doing art, whatever it is, you are always intervening in a conversation that's already been happening before you got there, right? So, as I'm doing this work, I'm intervening in a larger discussion, and I'm trying to say something to add to that discussion, right, or to shift that discussion. And so the discussion that I really see my work intervening on is actually around the politics and the pedagogies of aspiration. And there are a few different people or sort of ideas I want to highlight that really shape this study. So one this idea of a capacity to aspire, right? A scholar named un-interrogated is often sort of cited in relation to this idea because he really thinks about, you know, in unequal conditions, present conditions of possibility, we have unequal capacity to then navigate, right? And it's not about capacity being about some sort of inherent ability or like imaginative, like it's not saying that people in conditions of poverty don't have dreams and they don't have, you know, the sort of abilities. What it's saying is that conditions of poverty can themselves be disabling, right? They can actually shape in unequal ways how easily we move toward what we want and desire. Also, scholars who think about the temporal dimensions of aspiration, right? So we often think about aspiration as a striving toward the future we want. All of your answers in the beginning, dreams, hope, right? These were future-oriented. But those things are shaped by pasts that have been unequal, right? They're shaped by deprivations that have happened in the past. They are shaped by conditions of precarity in the present, right? So aspiration is both forward and backward-looking at the same time. Also thinking about scholarship on the apartheid legacy of constricting Black aspiration in South Africa in particular, right? So particularly a text called Pedagogy of Domination, right? Which thinks about sort of the ways in which apartheid educational policy itself was really meant to sort of restrict and constrict the aspirations, particularly of Black South Africans, right? To actually maintain a laboring class, right? And so how political aspiration is, even just given that history. And then finally thinking about pedagogies of aspiration, how in the context of societies where there's been a retreat from ideas of redistributing resources, of repairing the past, that schooling has become this terrain, especially as we see sort of more marketized economies where we see it as sort of the legitimate means to get ahead of everyone else, right? The legitimate means of social mobility. And pedagogies of aspiration are really about inculcating ideas that self-fashioning, self-improvement, right, self-presentation, the self and its interior is the major resource for social mobility, right? And if you don't get it together yourself, then that's on you. You lost, right? We beat the odds. And so I'm really thinking about sort of strains of scholarship that are sort of understanding aspiration and its politics. And I'll get into my interventions sort of broadly, and then for the rest of I have about 10 minutes, what I'm going to do is talk a bit about my main sort of interventions, but then I'm going to get into student voices and really kind of dive into some of what the people that I worked with that really taught me about aspiration and its politics in Cape Town shared. So to kind of get an overview, where I intervene with aspiration, like I said, one, I take a critical look at it, which itself is a little bit controversial, right? So aspiration, while it is something that, you know, I agree, I have my own aspirations and it's something that can drive us, it also operates as a portable market logic. And what do I mean by that? In the current context where there's a transnational spread of marketized forms of schooling, right? Charters, like I said, academies, low-fee private schools, marketized education reform is really bolstered by the idea of aspiration, right? It helps it travel to different contexts and seem really attractive, right? How could we not make schools that are, you know, really efficient with their discipline practices, can get rid of people easily so that everybody else can aspire toward their dreams? How can we not do that? How can we not have no excuses? Things are really tough. Secondly, another intervention that I make is that aspiration is not just temporal. It's not just thinking about sort of our past and our futures. Aspiration is a spatial imaginary. That image I showed you earlier, right, of even the overhead view of the landscape, right, Cape Town. When we think about aspiration, often it is about us entering spaces that we may have not been accessing before, right, not been able to access before. And one of the things that the school that I worked with in Cape Town really did differently than other schools is that they had a whole program around facilitating spatial transgressions for young people, right? Taking Black youth to contexts where often they had never been in their own city, right? They didn't necessarily feel welcome in. And not only taking them there, but telling them, claim space, right? Don't ask for permission. You know, if people aren't speaking your language and you're in a museum that you should have access to, demand that they bring a translator, right? So taking them into spaces and actually encouraging them to disrupt space and how it operates as part of their aspirational program. And then finally, thinking about sort of the affective politics of aspiration, and that's where I'll dive in more. And what I mean by that is aspiration, someone said dreams, right? I think you mentioned, Denise, you talked a bit about it, right? Our own sort of internal emotions, right? Feelings around our future, but also sort of, you know, our psyches, the different traumas that we may carry, these all shape our aspiration as well. And one of the things that the school I worked with did very well was have a focus on trauma-informed pedagogy. But it actually surfaced some critiques from students about where they need to go further and how we need to push the concept of aspiration. So this is where I'll sort of move into the main idea of thinking about breathwork and what it means. Just give me 1 second.
Wow, you did that good where I was sitting morning. I done took several.
So aspiration as breathwork, right? And really what brought me to thinking about breathwork. So I'll start off by just kind of bringing you into the school context, right? The actual research site that I was in. And this is a life orientation class being held outside at a launch school, right? And to give a little bit of background for you, life orientation is actually a national subject in South Africa. It was introduced in 1997 in the wake of the democratic transition from apartheid. The whole idea of the course originally was about teaching about the self in society, a forum for healing, for creating a new South Africa. However, in many schools across the nation, it's been treated, I don't know if any of you remember, like when I was in school, we had health class, where like health was kind of like that subject that like, you know, it was like people thought of it like a throwaway subject sometimes. Like we didn't really, well, LO, which is often called, life orientation is often called, at many schools has been sort of seen that way, right? Where it's a subject that has been kind of neglected, but Launch actually held this subject as their major sort of centerpiece of their school. They actually doubled the amount of time versus what was required by the state, and they used it as a forum to bring in trauma-informed pedagogy, to bring in licensed counselors and therapists that worked with teachers, that actually created spaces for young people to work through the things that they were going through in their lives. But not only sort of in a top-down manner, but to actually help students understand how to support each other, right? And so one of the features of that is a daily circle, right, of 50 minutes that is, you know, really intended to be non-hierarchical, where teachers and students both participate, where people can work through their issues. And a lot of what they do is bring in mindfulness practices. And one of the key practices they bring in is breath work, right? Sort of, you know, exercises in breathing to kind of slow down, to gain awareness in one's own body, to open up the space to even have discussions. And I participated in this often with students. You know, I heard people share about their own journeys. And as I was back in the United States writing, you know, of this work and this research, we were in the midst of a COVID, you know, the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. I started to think about breath in really different ways, right? Because even in my own personal life, some of the people that had been impacted who were actually struggling to breathe, losing their breath, right? So I started to actually think more about this piece of Launch's approach. And they framed it as key to aspiration, right? That spaces like this were key to allowing young people to work through their traumas and their challenges to aspire more effectively. But then I started to realize, let me back up for a minute. I want to kind of give you a voice of a student thinking about this and then kind of get into the next piece. So this is Babala, who was a Launch alumna and a life orientation teacher. She became a life orientation teacher later. But she told me that she hated life orientation at first. And she hated doing breath work, and she hated the space of sort of talking about your issues. She felt very uncomfortable with it. But it's something that over time really changed her, to the point where she actually changed her whole sort of mission and became a teacher. And she said the LO teacher would make us breathe. She would call it dialectics. She would say we must breathe, and the aim was that we can focus on what was going on with ourselves. Then after, we share how we were feeling. You could talk about how your living circumstances affect you. You could talk about things people usually protect. I started seeing how my classmates and friends were changing from participating and sharing how relieved they would be. And then I saw, okay, I'm not the only one going through this or going through that. At launch, that's when I got to really feel and speak the things that I was not allowing myself to feel. And because of that, I was able to be free. And I want to focus on a key piece of what struck me about what she's saying is that it wasn't only the space to work through her stuff, but it was actually the sort of collective experience of seeing that what she was experiencing was shared across other young people, right? That it wasn't specific to her situation. And that was a space that opened up a whole new perspective for her. Now, this is kind of what originally brought me to really kind of centering my work around aspiration, thinking about actually aspiration itself. While we put all those words earlier, no one said breath. But aspiration actually comes, right, from this idea of breathing, right? When we look it up, we can see that it's to strive for, to seek, to eagerly attain, to long to reach. But its origins, right, actually come from two words. One is the word for to or toward, right? And that can be in space or in time. And another is the word for to breathe, right? We know respiration, we know inspire, we know these other words. So aspiration as breath work is something that I started to think about more deeply, both from the literal practices in launch schools, but also from the sort of more multivalent understandings of this. And what do I mean by that? I started to look to Black Studies scholarship, right, and people who have written about aspiration, right? And in particular, I was really sitting with Christina Sharp's work in the Wake on Blackness and Being, where she talks about how for Black youth in the Wake, and what she means by in the Wake is, you know, across the globe in the wake of systems like enslavement, right, like apartheid, like, you know, forced migrations, right, that sort of these things continue to shape the atmospheres, right, in which we all live, right, and those atmospheres are hostile, right, they can shape our ability to breathe, they can constrict our ability to breathe. And for her, she wanted to really think about the multivalent stakes of this, and I really picked up on that, thinking again about what I said. It's temporal, it's spatial, it's affective, it's also individual and collective. But then the last thing that I really started to zoom in on from what a student said, and I'll get to that student in a minute, is that aspiration is violent and life-saving. Now, violent, why are we bringing that in, right? So Christina Sharp asked us this question: what are the words and the forms and the ways that we must continue to think and imagine across a series of relations in the multiple Black everydays of the Wake, right? Across the diaspora, across context, right, of, you know, of conditions of anti-Blackness. And she says the word that she arrives at for putting breath back in the Black body in hostile weather is aspiration, but then zooms in on this piece: aspiration is violent and life-saving. So I started to really think about that through some of the critiques that students raised. And I'm going to get into one student, Anati, and I will use some of her perspectives to close us out today. And Anati was a student who I spent a lot of time with. She's an alumna now. She works in one of the, you know, globe's biggest advertising firms. She, by all means, has sort of achieved the aspirations of launch, right? At the time that I met her, she was living in Langa. She was still living in a hostel, which is a space, right, that historically was constructed for Black male laborers, right, to live on their own, to actually, you know, work in the neighboring white areas of the city, to not bring their families with them. It is a space that she critiqued a lot for how it shaped her own life and her own sort of experience daily and how tough that was. But she had a lot of thoughts, because I asked her at one point, what is the part of launch that you would not change, and what is the part that you would change? And she said life orientation. And she said, just like Babawa earlier, that space to breathe, that space to think about her own journey and her aspirations was life-saving. But it also raised some issues for her. She said, I would have appreciated if launch also conscientized learners about how the social ills are the result of our history as South Africans. Now that I'm older, it feels as though it was suppressing that part of learning. which could have impacted our growth and understanding of why our lives are the way they are, why it is necessary for launch to exist. Their idea was more to keep us away from the negativity in townships. So a key thing is that, again, she's pointing out that, again, right, trauma-informed pedagogy, which we're thinking about in the US a lot, across contexts, especially in the wake of the pandemic and all the things that we have experienced. But if trauma-informed pedagogy individualizes trauma, right, as related to your own household, your own story, and doesn't sort of look at the structural roots of it and connect it to the societies in which we live, it can do damage, right? Just like, you know, these other narratives of grit and resilience, right? And even thinking about that earlier quote from Sharp, the violent piece, right? Often trauma-informed pedagogy is used to encourage more resilience, right, in Black youth, right? Rather than thinking about, well, how do we intervene on the conditions that are requiring such resilience, right? So she's really honing in on that directly and saying, how come we're not then taking that leap to look at what's shaping us to all have this same experience, right? And I asked her at one point, I said, you know, I asked her what was one of her most, you know, impactful educational experiences in terms of her own development. And what struck me was that she didn't name school. The experience she named was not from school. It was from a youth movement that she had participated in her community. And in particular, this movement was called the Youth Consciousness Movement, and they were really trying to intervene on service disparities in their township, and they were also trying to sort of do popular education with each other. And she said it was a youth movement. It had an impact on how I see things now, how I see myself, and how I see the world. We challenge ourselves to learn a history that we didn't get in school and how it connects to current issues. Land inequality, capitalism, the kind of food we're consuming. It was a space where we shared information about historical events and knowledge about us as Kosa-speaking people, or Guni people, or Black people, and the kind of impact as young people we could have in our society. I started reading more, right? And she said she wasn't reading just people from South Africa. She talks to me about people they were reading about survival programs from the Black Panther Party here in the US. They were reading about, you know, people sort of, you know, Julius Nyerere. They were reading in the Tanzanian context. They were reading across, right? And she says we didn't have solutions, but the process was to learn and conscientize each other. Even when we went home in December, right, to our families, doing research, learning from them as much as we could. And this is kind of what really kind of gave me a thrust to start thinking beyond aspiration, right? She says to me, at one point, we were talking about a particular initiative that they had to clean the streets, right, in her community, because one of the issues with service delivery is sanitation inequality, right? And she says, you know that vibe when the streets have this kind of fresh air? Because everyone is working together towards something good, right? It had that effect in our community, right? And she talks about even how, you know, through working together, they decided to sort of document this, right? And post it on Twitter for the city and to sort of publicize what they were doing in ways that eventually activated the city to actually come and do their job, right? And they hadn't been actually cleaning that particular drain for a minute. So why am I highlighting this? Anati really pushed me to think about aspiration differently and about schooling differently, right? If we want schooling contexts where we're thinking about creating more breathing room in hostile atmospheres for Black youth, we have to think beyond aspiration, right? Aspiration is so important, so I'm not negating it, right? For us to understand our own journey and our dreams and our hopes. But if it is used to sort of reinforce liberal individualist notions of the self, right, is the main sort of resource we have, then it actually can end up kind of reproducing those same unequal grounds on which we are aspiring. So one of the things Anati was pushing for, right, is thinking beyond, right, the self, but also thinking about the conditions. She said, I learned about my own self, but also the world. And so I started to think about this idea of breathing together, which everyone did at launch every single day that I was there. Breathing together, there's a word for that. And that word, right, is to conspire, right? That same focus on breath, but the shift, right, from the toward, right, to the with, right? And thinking about how, again, education in schools can create more breathing room by actually sort of moving beyond aspiration and also learning from educational contexts outside of school. So one of the big things that happened in Cape Town was that I actually, through young people, through friends, I started to actually see that beyond schools, this type of focusing on activating the capacity to conspire was actually present in education. It just wasn't present in the schools I was in, right? But it was present in activist education, in popular education movements. So I'll give two examples. And this is actually an image from high school students in Cape Town's parliament who are part of the youth movement called Equal Education. And they're actually protesting at a public hearing for an amendment that would authorize privately managed public schools. And you can actually see them up here doing that, right? Another example that I'll share is thinking about movements outside of school, right? So the housing and land justice movement in Cape Town called Reclaim the City, and a friend of mine who was an activist with that movement is here today, but also thinking about how, she really shifted my perspective because at one point she invited me to a conference about pedagogy, but it was specifically pedagogy in popular education movements, right? All outside of schools. And rather than thinking about building a capacity to aspire to access space individually, they were thinking about how do we build consciousness so people understand how has our space been constructed this way? How is it continuing to be developed unevenly, right? How is the city colluding with private developers in ways that carry this on? And then how can we use the courts and the streets, right, to actually intervene on this? And so thinking about education beyond individual aspiration toward that capacity to aspire. And I'll end by just saying, this is my last slide, but I just want to say that thinking about this through the youth that I worked with, the families and educators, the community members, but also thinking about this through an Africana Studies lens, right? Black scholars, Black activists across time, and how they thought about aspiration. So I want to end with words from Steve Biko, Black consciousness leader in South Africa, who said, and really tied the actual very definition in his view of Blackness to aspiration, right? Saying, we have defined Blacks as those who are by law or tradition politically, economically, and socially discriminated against as a group in the South African society, and identifying themselves as a unit in their struggle towards the realization of their aspirations. So I will end with those words, and again just say I'm hoping to really think myself as an educator, and even with teachers and back in school context about how we can bring in this focus on a capacity to conspire, along with thinking about how to move toward their aspirations. So thank you so much for that.
When you talk about the chat school, it's really funny because the charter school that I grew up in is the one that replaced the chat school. So literally, like when I had moved into the building, like the whole logos and stuff weren't taken down yet. So there was like a canopy over the chat school one. And there was like inside the gymnasium, it was kind of like scratched out a little bit, and then basically like a spray paint. Yeah. And so first, when you talk about the chat school, I found it really funny because I was like, technically I went to the building and I was in the same space that you were, but not at the same time, which created a different experience. And so that's really interesting. Because the marketization of the school made it so that they didn't really care about learning different historical things, where we had just been, the connection to those who had been before. They had taken away social studies and things like that, because in order to pass a math, English, and science exam, we only need math, English, and science. And so those were just 2 hours, 3 hours a day, just focusing on this one subject. So when you talk about that, I was like, oh my God, war flashbacks, because you were just talking about everything that I had experienced. We used to memorize these different poems every day, and I still talk to old friends, and we still have it memorized because that was part of the history. And it's always so funny seeing the look on people's faces when I tell them that just to leave the classroom we had to go through 7 different steps of crossing your hands and then standing by the desk and then standing in line and then walking out one foot at a time. So yeah, first all of that was just whoa. And then the questions that I had, I know you had traveled to South Africa and saw all of the different was just wondering what the experience was like coming back to the U.S. and how those different things translated. Because I know that even though, like in Africa, or at least, you know, like when Pranam talks about the experience or like the fact that Black people, it's like, you know, when you're around other Black people, you are just who you are, you know, and then there's different like, oh, I'm Nigerian or I'm like whatever, but like different places in the diaspora, and it's not until the U.S. that you really have to confront with like being Black. And so I was wondering, you know, how that experience like translated back over, and then what this process looks like for those that have to compete with the current structure of education. So like even though we're in like a college setting, a professor can like choose to do ref work at the beginning of class that's not wholly accessible to maybe like the newer public schools district or to some of the schools.
So thank you for sharing your experiences and also a few questions. I'll try to address them as best I can. But actually, even what you said about sort of the emptying out of social studies and the focus on math and science and, you know, literacy, even when were you in that school? Do you remember, like around what year?
From 2008 to 2016.
Yeah. So even coming into Norfolk schools and working in a context where, yeah, we were encouraged to kind of focus on just math and literacy and like subversively teaching social studies, even in an elementary school context. So I definitely can relate to what you were talking about. I would say in terms of the main question that kind of sparked me is when you said about sort of traveling and you know, interacting with people in an entirely different setting, experiencing a different school system, and then returning here to the U.S., not only to New York, but, you know, I was at Columbia, so I was in New York public schools too, and I've worked in New York City public schools. And I would say that one of the big things that stands out to me is that there has been a shift since the early 2000s when I started teaching of more scrutiny of these no excuses discipline practices and of, you know, punitive kind of school practices that really at one point were sort of celebrating being connected to a broken windows policing idea. Like even many of you may be familiar with the book Teach Like a Champion, which comes out of one of the schools I was working with. And literally its first edition is sort of celebrating how it's drawn from, you know, these ideas of broken windows, right? And get at this tiniest behavior, then, you know, the bigger behavior won't come, right? So these really, really terrible ways to think about schooling, really punitive, really dehumanizing ways to think about schooling. And I think that there's been a shift where those have become, they've been scrutinized more, and so a lot of charters have had to kind of reckon with that and have had to actually answer to some of that criticism and shift how they think about discipline in their school context. But one of my major concerns is that those practices are still traveling around the world. So we're seeing, you know, a shift here in the States where now, you know, these things are attracting more attention and we're saying, no, that's not going to work, it's racist because it's not happening across all schools, it's happening in Black and brown schools. But even as that's happening, books like Teach Like a Champion are selling worldwide, right? And those are actually packages of professional development. Even that handout that I showed, right, was part of a teacher workshop that was facilitated by folks who had worked with charter schools in the U.S. and academy schools in the United Kingdom, right? So those are still, you know, profit-generating, you know, sort of programs that are being exploited. And I think that this is why I started sort of having a transnational lens on education reform. I think is really important because this is something that is really connected. And even I showed that image of the high school students protesting in Cape Town Parliament. And that was in 2018, right? That was when that amendment was first introduced to allow privately managed public schools. Just last week, on November 2nd, right, Equal Education, their law center division actually went to court, right? Actually sort of challenging this amendment, right? So it's still being played out around, and that was explicitly, even the sort of, you know, legislators there that were responsible for writing that bill, they explicitly talk about borrowing models from the US charter schools and from the UK academy schools that are successful, yet the data shows that that's not, you know, the story, right? It's much more complicated than that, but that narrative is still able to travel, that this is the best new sort of frontier of schooling, and that, you know, it should shape education for racially marginalized youth across the board. Because again, even in Cape Town, this is not being recommended for all schools, right? It is being recommended particularly in township schools, these changes are happening in government schools, not in schools that are, elite and wealthy. So I know you asked a few other questions. I forgot all of them.
We'll keep it moving, but just a heads up, we have about 15 minutes left. If you haven't already grabbed a sandwich or chips, please feel free to do that as we continue the conversation.
Yeah.
Yes.
Hi, thank you for this. So, wow, I'm working on some of, my work around education. Education is like a big thing. Black education as a whole. And so I think the question that keeps coming up for me, and I'm interested to hear your perspective, but is it really, especially in a place like Newark, is it beneficial to even keep the school systems, charter, private, and public the way that they are? Or do we need to create the whole thing again? And I mean that in community-based view. Yeah, I know.
So, I mean, this is a huge question as you know.
I know.
And asking it. And even as you're connecting it to Newark, which I think is really key, right? It's a question that is relevant across context, right? Because that same question, even speaking to education activists and educators in Cape Town, similar question, right? Around how even the transition out of apartheid, part of the sort of hope was that the unequal schooling that had been set up very intricately would be sort of equalized, right? But that didn't happen, partially because the distinction between public and private was able to be maintained, and so and what ended up happening in that case was that public schools that had, formerly white public schools that had been very well resourced, that had been, that had long traditions of high quality education, were actually then semi-privatized, right? To prevent people from sort of having a massive exodus from the public system by equalizing it, those schools were then given more autonomy over their own sort of, admissions practices, right? Which again are ways of gatekeeping, whether or not to have fees, et cetera, right? So the sort of public-private distinction, and then now this third lane, which is what I'm really concerned with around marketization, the public-private, right? And it's creating a new tier, right? And so I didn't really get a chance to talk about what I mean when I say marketization, but it's important that I do so. And I use that word instead of privatization very purposely. When I think about marketization, I think about how public systems, right, the increased use of market forces in public systems, right? So choice, right? So it's not that, every neighborhood has a school that you can go to. It's that, there is a shuffling, there is a choice of there is schools sort of can compete for particular students, people can compete to get into particular schools. There is funding that can come from, from private sources. And part of what that does is it makes it so that the public system itself is now, having all these other forces. So it's not just about private schooling. Yeah. It's about the public system operating more like a marketplace than one where you have access to a public school, in your vicinity. So I'm dancing around your question because, again, it's the bigger question that I'm going to be sitting with too. But I think that one of my bigger concerns is, I think for a long time we've been so concerned with the public-private and the distinctions therein and the hierarchies therein. But I think a big part of our concerns has to be that third tier, which is actually growing everywhere, which is the public-private. Right? Yeah. So yeah, I saw two people.
Well, Mike, as you're speaking, I'm thinking about Wakanda. And so at the end of the, so what came up with is it Fallon? Yes. Fallon's question really dovetails into something you pointed out, which is that most of the learning spaces that people reflected on were those learning spaces outside of school. At the end of the Black Panther that came out some years ago, they were going back into the community to bring in their own science learning space, right? Where they were going to have the kids learn outside of the system. So I think in your studies of people being able to have this capacity to conspire, so the aspiration to happen in the right space, what would be your thought about standing up those outside of the system learning spaces? You don't worry about killing the system. You just build up the learning spaces outside of the system, like some of the communities.
Yeah, I like that question. And I'll say, again, coming out of working in schools, both district public schools and charters here, and also working with public schools in New York City too, I think that those spaces definitely need to be bolstered and supported, and they're doing a great service, right? That's not happening in schools. So I think that, you know, I'm very much, I look to that as what we can learn to bring into schools, right? That is one of my biggest, because, you know, the system, whether it's, you know, public, private, whatever, it touches so many young people, right? So, and I think that often, you know, teachers in their classrooms, me, myself, we think that by sort of just focusing on how can you yourself be gods, like how can each of these, that is going to sort of be the antidote, right? But what happens again is it misses a larger conversation, even like Amelia was saying, where was the social studies, right? How might it have a sense of the larger journey of how we got here to this point? That my school was very different from a school like, you know, 3 miles away. And I think that is very threatening, obviously, to bring into schools in some way, right? Because it raises questions in young people where they might then, yeah, they might have more sort of, even just, you know, you don't want to bring it as an exercise in like cynicism, but I think that, you know, the potential to have more critical spaces in schools, I think is there. I just think, and not only there just from a systematic perspective, but even from teachers' perspective, because teachers are often really hungry to even have their own space to have these conversations, right? So in workshops where we're, you know, talking about building a disciplinary climate, like we're missing an opportunity to ask questions with educators about how to set up environments where students can actually be critical and actually engage in some of these kinds of interrogations. So I think that, and even what, you know, the student in Nazi was pointing out was like, you know, she got this somewhere else, right? Not all of her peers were so lucky, right? And they already had the infrastructure, right? They had daily circles every day for 50 minutes, right? Where they were able to, and it wasn't that, you know, that there weren't opportunities, it's just that inculcating that kind of interrogation is also a practice, right? So it's not about teaching young people what to think and what their story of the political history should be, but more about even opening a space for them to ask questions. So I'll give a concrete example. One of the things that often happened when I was working at Launch is that it's located in London, which is the township community. Often there are protests, right? Service delivery protests, because, you know, things like water, things like sanitation, like basic needs, are not sort of equally, you know, distributed. And so people are angry, right? And so I would often get like a WhatsApp that would say like, no school today, service delivery protest, with like a pictures, like people burning tires or whatever, right? But what I noticed was that, and this is something not to point out too, but what I noticed was that when we came back to school the next day, like there was never a space of, well, why'd that happen? Like, and there was one point where actually the local post office, when I first started working at school, was burned down. And I remember talking to some of the young people like, yeah, these people just burned down the post office because they don't. But then talking to students like a Nazi, they were like, well, actually, there's an inequality in how our services are delivered, and people are angry because of this. And, you know, I live in a community where, you know, the drains are not clean, where we have to deal with raw sewage. There are communities that don't have to deal with that, right? And this is something that we all should have access to as citizens, right, in the city. And then them actually taking initiative to start cleaning, and then actually not only a sort of self-help, but then actually broadcasting and saying, this is your job, we're doing it. You should be doing it, come do it, right? And that working for them. And so even that shift of like showing up to school the next day after hearing the day before there was no school because of the protest, but not then having a forum of like, like what's going on here? Why is this happening? Do you know what I mean? And so I think that even just engaging young people in space to think about what's already like happening in their daily surroundings is enough
So we have a hard stop at 2:20, but if maybe there's just a couple of comments we can take together. So, Nisa?
I just wanted to say, this is my second time coming to this forum, but there was one thing I didn't catch before that I caught now, and it was with the girl, she was talking about how she wasn't, she was talking, you know how you was talking about the question as to why they didn't speak about like the apartheid or why they wasn't spoken about in class. That kind of happens, that's kind of how I feel about mine, because I went to a private school, and I had the tools, but we wasn't taught about why, you know, our education system is the way it is, and we wasn't taught, and they were basically teaching us that like, you should be happy with what you had because you go to a private school, but they wasn't teaching us about our history and whatnot, and it wasn't until I got to spaces like this to where I'm being taught. I just wanted to say I connected with her on that.
Sure.
And I think, you know, this is something that I can relate to also even as a teacher, right? Because so when I moved into teaching middle and high school, I was teaching history, right? And, you know, you teach about the civil rights movement, you teach about school segregation, right? And it becomes very sort of like the sort of elephant in the room because you're looking around and it's like, we're still in a segregated school, y'all. And, you know, this is something that, again, forms to actually then raise those questions like a youth movement that's really interesting out of New York City is Integrate NYC, right? Where young people actually then started saying, wait a second, we're learning about this in the book, but this is literally what our schools look like now. And then they started actually asking questions. They went all the way into the state legislature, right, to bring this up. So again, I think the space to sort of spark that kind of conversation in the classroom is really important.
So let's give a round of applause.